Welcome to PHRP Perspectives, your go-to resource for navigating ethics, compliance, and best practices in human subjects research. Each episode delivers expert insights, practical advice, and real-world stories to help you stay ahead and make informed decisions. PHRP Perspectives is brought to you by PHRP Online Training.
Earn your certification for Human Subjects Protection Training with PHRP Online Training. PHRP offers 2 courses, PHRP Online Training for biomedical or clinical topics, and PHRP SBE, which is designed for social, behavioral, and educational research. Continuing education credits are available for a variety of professionals. PHRP Online Training is available in English, Spanish, and French. Learn more at phrptraining.com.
And now, here is PHRP Perspectives, Ethics, Research, and Compliance.
Hello, I'm your host, Susan Court, and welcome to PHRP Perspectives. Joining me are Joe Smith, PHRP Advisory Board Member, and his guest, Vidhi Rami. Today's topic is Reliance Agreements and Collaborating with HRPPs. Joe is a certified IRB professional with 20 years' experience in human research protections and regulatory compliance. Additionally, he has 10 years' experience as the Conflict of Interest Administrator at the University of Maryland, College Park, and has been the Director of Human Research Protection Program at UMD for 15 years. Vidhi Rami joined the UMD Human Research Protection Office in December 2021. She obtained her MPH from the University of Maryland School of Public Health in May 2022. Vidhi is also a certified IRB professional, CIP. As the IRB specialist, Reliance Agreements, Vidhi supports general IRB office functions, approves exempt and expedited research, and is the point person within the Office for Reliance Agreements. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Susan.
So, Joe, start off by talking about today's topic and what you and Vidhi are going to focus your conversation on.
So today we're going to talk about reliance agreements, and these are agreements between 2 institutions that are meant to reduce administrative burden and get human subject research moving along much quicker without any additional delays. Thankfully, at our institution, we were able to bring on Vidhi a few years ago, and she's been very instrumental in managing our program, implementing much needed changes, taking a look back on some old projects and old agreements that we had and bringing them up to speed. So looking forward to talking about this today because it's something we talk about a lot, and it's something that's really gained a full head of steam in the regulatory universe over the past 5 years or so. So Vidhi, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Joe?
I'm great too. Let's
Awesome.
let's talk about how we can reduce some administrative burden through this process. Because I know our investigators are very pleased when we can offer this as a solution,
Totally.
so they can avoid having to go through this process at both institutions, or I should say, go through the IRB application process through both institutions. So first off, let's start with some definitions so we can understand where we're coming from. Vidhi, why don't you take us through what multi-site studies and collaborations are, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So typically, IRBs can only review and cover the research activities of investigators who are affiliated with their institution. So if an external investigator is involved in a project with another institution, then their institution would have to cover their role in the research. So essentially, a reliance agreement allows the collaborating institution to rely on an IRB that is reviewing the project. So instead of 2 IRBs reviewing the same project, 1 IRB will review the project, and the collaborating institution can rely on their review. So essentially, the reliance agreement is the document or the actual agreement between 2 or more institutions to document this reliance, and then the terms that each institution agrees to kind of facilitate the review process. And
So I know we're going to
oversight.
go through this a little bit later, but that reliance agreement process is not just a back and forth email. It involves a couple of different documents and terms, like you said.
Right.
Okay.
It involves, collecting local context for where the research is being conducted, making sure that a reliance agreement is appropriate for the collaboration, making sure that they're engaged in human subjects research. So yeah, it's definitely an involved process that involves, the HRPP office, the researchers, any relying institutions.
Okay. So when we talk about who's reviewing, who's relying, who decides that? So let's start with the reviewing institution. Okay. When we say reviewing institution, we're referring to the institution that is handling the IRB review, right?
Right. And they're assuming the oversight of the project.
So with regard to oversight, can you give us an example or two of the types of things that they'd be responsible for besides managing all the IRB review, IRB transaction reviews and things like that?
Sure. So if there are any adverse events, typically the team would submit these reports to the reviewing IRB. And based on the terms of the agreement, the reviewing IRB typically reports these adverse events to the appropriate individuals. They would also be, monitoring the research to make sure it's going as planned. That could either be planned or just an unplanned, QA of the research.
Great, right. So let's say, and hopefully I'm not getting ahead of ourselves here, but let's just say that there's an incident at the reviewing IRB and there's a quality assurance review or audit that needs to take place. I'd assume that the reviewing IRB needs to talk to the relying IRB, right, and let them know what's going on?
Right. They would have to communicate their findings and that this monitoring is going on. If it is a multi-site study where the study is being conducted at both sites, typically the IRBs will collaborate to conduct the monitoring of the situation.
That's great, and I'm sure that you might have a couple of extra steps if you have more than just one institution that's relying. So if you have one of these large multi-center clinical trials, there's established communication.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's then move on to the relying IRB. So what does the relying IRB do? What do they just sit back and throw their hands up, or what's their involvement?
Yeah, it depends on the institution and the type of involvement that they've outlined in their SOPs. But the relying institution is, the IRB or the institution that is relying on the reviewing IRB. The institution does not have to have an affiliated IRB. They only have to have a FWA, which is the federal-wide assurance, which is basically an agreement between the institution and HHS that they will comply by the federal regulations of human subjects research. The relying institution is typically responsible for ensuring that their investigators are well-equipped to conduct the research, so they have appropriate training, they have the appropriate qualifications, and that the study team has the resources that they need to conduct the research.
That's a good point. All of those things, the last list of things you mentioned, are key to making sure that an agreement like this can be established. But one of the things that I learned along the way while we were sort of revamping our reliance agreement process at our institution is the fact that a relying institution doesn't have to have a sitting IRB. They don't have to have an established IRB as long as they have a federal-wide assurance with the Department of Health and Human Services. They can receive federal dollars and they can rely on an institution that has an IRB process, or they can contract with a private IRB, a commercial IRB, right?
Right. So a lot of nonprofit organizations that do conduct research, they will have an FWA number with HHS, but they don't have an IRB office. So typically they'll work with, a commercial IRB or work with a local university to use their IRB services.
That's great. I think that adds an extra layer of flexibility depending on, who it is that's received the award, and it doesn't sort of wall them off from this regulatory process that's required. Really. So great. Okay, this is a good start. I think it's I'm always a big fan of kind of looking back and seeing where these things came from. So why don't let's get into the history of reliance agreements and kind of where we are now.
Yeah, so it kind of all started with some federal requirements to have a single IRB for multi-site review. Back in 2017, the NIH instituted a policy requiring all non-exempt NIH-funded domestic multi-site studies to use a single IRB for the review of their project. A few years later, with the revised Common Rule, there was the policy that all studies receiving federal funding that are again, U.S.-based, non-exempt, and collaborative that are funded by an agency that have adopted the revised Common Rule adhere to the single IRB requirement. So this all started, let's say, 8 or so years ago. There are some carve-outs for the single IRB requirement. So if there's a study where there might be a local law that requires additional review, such as tribal IRB review, they're exempt from the single IRB process, so they can adhere to that law. For studies that are conducted outside of the U.S., they're also not required to adhere to the single IRB rule. And then there was also an exemption in place during COVID for a few years where single IRB was not practical because of how unpredictable the time was. Institutions didn't have to adhere to that. But I wasn't, involved in Reliance Agreements during COVID. Joe, do you have any experience?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, I'll just say there's a lot of opportunities to be flexible during that period of time. And that, holds true for Reliance Agreements, and in the same way it held true for being able to take an IRB application that was 100% in person and then shift it online. We, I think, made some exceptions to what was established so we could make sure that the research could continue and that it wasn't held up any more than the state of the world would hold it up at that time. So it was clunky, but to be expected. And I think we all made it through, learning a little bit more. I mean, when you're faced with some adversity there, you learn to be a little bit more flexible and maybe think about some of the things that aren't as necessary to collect or to demand or whatever it might be. So in a nutshell, we learned a lot, but we're still able to kind of get through that period of time with a lot of flexibility. So,
right. And the single IRB requirement was meant to reduce IRB burden. So I can understand if during COVID it was increasing the burden. The exemption is probably helpful for
HRPPs. And to sort of walk it back to you talking about the revised Common Rule requirements in 2019, they did give you some grace period for implementing the updates to the requirement. And I think the regulators realized that it was going to take some time to, especially for like big multi-center trials, clinical trials, cancer center trials, for them to reach out to these other institutions and to, meet with these requirements and stay in compliance or come up into compliance. So I think if I remember correctly, it might have been about a year to get these into place. But anyways, back to you, and we'll move on to past the exemptions if you're ready.
Yeah. There are a few things that are required to document in a Reliance Agreement relationship. The agreement itself should document the roles and responsibilities of each institution, such as who is providing the review, who's monitoring or auditing or conducting for-cause investigations of the study, who's responsible for reporting noncompliance. All of these things, typically the reviewing IRB is responsible for as the institution with oversight over the study. And then we would also document who's responsible for ensuring that the investigators are qualified to conduct the study, as I said before, and that's typically something that the relying institution will take on, but It's not something that the reviewing IRB doesn't check for during their review of the study. I know in my experience, I still want to make sure that relying investigators have the training in place that they need to conduct the study, even though this is technically a responsibility of the relying institution. When I'm going through Reliance Agreements, I want to see everyone's training as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. For Reliance Agreements, HHS does offer a one-pager agreement that does outline the terms I just described, but this does not meet the requirements of AHRP to document Reliance Agreements. So institutions who are AHRP accredited kind of need to create their own Reliance Agreement to document these additional terms. And the additional requirements clearly document every role involved in the process, just to make sure that there's no confusion down the line.
So yeah, it's nice to have sort of the floor set by the regulators on the one pager, which is something that we did for years until we went through, I think it was our second round of AHRP accreditation, and they said, you know what, the one page is not going to cut it anymore. And so we got on to Smart IRB, we adopted their SOPs. You've created a number of extremely helpful documents that are geared towards our policies and procedures here, but still meet with the sort of gold standard of the Smart IRB platform and their SOPs. So, the one page is great as a starting point. I think it's great for institutions that are not going through the AHRP process. For years, we used it, and it was extremely helpful and quick. But we did realize that we were not collecting the information that we probably should have to make us feel a little bit better about who we were relying on and vice versa. But with that being said, I'm curious if you know off the top of your head, how many do we see a year how many Reliance agreements do we see a year in our office?
I'd say maybe 75 to 100 a year, unique agreements. And then, we'll check in periodically with existing agreements to make sure that someone's institution hasn't changed. And if so, then we'd execute another one. So I'd say around 75 to 100.
That's good. Yeah, I think the numbers have increased a little bit since we did the one pager. I feel like we were somewhere in the maybe 40 to 60 range back maybe 10 years ago. But since then, it's really ramped up.
Totally. And I think there's been an overall increase in education over Reliance agreements and the different routes you can go for multi-site studies. And I think with researcher education, with funding agencies, recommending single IRB use, I think that's also contributing to the increase.
Totally understand. Totally agree. I think that all of these, just helps us flow into our next topic, which is what are the benefits of the Reliance agreement? I think we touched on a few of them already, but let's take it a step further and talk about how it's not only beneficial, internally, but externally.
Totally. I think for researchers who are engaging in multi-site studies, it completely avoids the duplicative IRB review process.
Right.
So essentially, if each institution that's involved in the research has to review the project, the single IRB will, limit that to just one IRB reviewing the project. And really, if all of the institutions are reviewing the research per the same regulations, then it's incredibly duplicative for each institution to review the same project. So it really reduces the burden for the researchers so that only one lead team will submit to the IRB for review, and then the other collaborating investigators can follow. But then also it limits the number of documents that the research team needs to handle, the number of approval letters that they need to work with, how many times the consent form is reviewed by an IRB and then comments are sent back. So it really limits documentation for the researchers.
Yeah, that's a
so
big
it's
one.
easier to handle. Yeah. Joe, what are the benefits for an HRPP? I know we've talked about it a bit, but if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of follows the same thing, the same pathway. It eliminates the duplicative review. I mean, the back and forth with, you forgot to put this contact information in the consent form. We have to have this language for compensation in the consent form because our institution requires this. I mean, there were some projects in years past where, you would just continuously go through rounds and rounds of modifications. And once one institution was done and they sent it back, the other institution would find something else. And it might take months to get, a relatively straightforward project off the ground because, you're quibbling over minor administrative details that, your institution might require because that's what policy says, but doesn't necessarily have an impact on the human subject research review process. So I think that there's probably enough lobbying to the regulators and from investigators, as well as I'm sure the agencies themselves saw this and saw how long it was taking to get these projects approved. And they just said, you know what, we're not going to leave this up to the institutions to figure out. We're just going to make it a requirement for these federally funded projects because we need to get it moving. And otherwise, I would assume that's a waste of money at some point, right?
Right.
Right. So in addition to it being a huge benefit for the HRPO, the office itself, with other entities in the HRPP, like your Office of Research Administration, they get the approvals faster, they get to open the accounts faster, the money goes out faster to the investigators, and it just speeds up the process. So they can kind of check that off their list and get moving forward, really. So there's added benefit to this whole thing to the entire HRPP throughout the Reliance Agreement process. And I'm sure that down the line, the investigators are experiencing it. They might not even know that they're getting this benefit. But yeah, great push forward for this all around, I think. But let's look at the other side of things here, because I know that we push for this a lot, as often as we can do it. If the opportunity arises, we want to pursue a Reliance Agreement to take work off of us and work off another institution. But I know there's cases where another institution might decline to do this. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, in my experience, most institutions decline to enter into a Reliance Agreement because their investigator isn't involved in human subjects research. If their institution isn't involved in the research, by definition, a Reliance Agreement isn't needed. So that's the most common. It does involve a lot of conversation with your researcher to see what their role in the project is, parsing out whether they're working with identifiable information or de-identified information. Sometimes they don't know, and we err on the side of caution, or we just wait for them to tell us, de-identified data wasn't enough. I need to work with identifiable data. So figuring out whether an investigator is involved in human subjects research is huge. That really defines whether or not a Reliance Agreement can move forward.
Yeah, good point.
And then also some institutions make it kind of a policy that they won't enter into a Reliance Agreement unless it's required. So that's a requirement by the funding agency. If there's no federal funding, some institutions won't engage in a Reliance Agreement. And I can't speak to why, but I do know that some institutions have adopted this policy, which personally, I think Reliance Agreements make things a lot easier, like we talked about before. But, there could be a burden for the institution financially to, take on the oversight of research. So they might decline if it's not required.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. And then also, if the institution doesn't have the expertise to review the project, they might defer. They might say, I can't be the reviewing IRB, but maybe we can rely on another collaborating institution. So a good example of this is if an institution, typically conducts research of social and behavioral research or review of social behavioral research, and they have a project coming in that's more clinical leaning, and they don't have experience reviewing clinical research, they might defer the reviewing responsibility to a collaborating institution that is a clinical research institution that's maybe affiliated with a hospital. So they might decline to be the reviewing IRB, but will still rely on another IRB if they're willing to review.
Yeah, that's I think a reasonable and very rational approach in that case. Right. That's a real obvious lack of resources there. So yeah, good example.
Yeah.
So let's say we do get to the point, everybody's agreed that we're going to do this. It's not always super smooth when we begin the Reliance Agreement process with another institution that agrees to enter into it. So let's get into some of the difficulties working with institutions who have approaches that might differ from our institution or, another institution.
Sure. Yeah. The Reliance Agreement process is one that each institution handles differently. So it can be really hard to work with outside offices that maybe I don't know what their processes are, and I'm, left hanging for a few weeks while they're completing their requirements. I'm just not made aware of what's going on their end. So often the Reliance Agreement communication between IRB offices can be lengthy, and it's hard to know where you stand without following up, without asking, what are the next steps for your institution? It's not always clearly communicated. So it can be hard knowing where you stand in the execution process if there's not good communication. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that as a as a longtime administrator and looking for ways to sort of eliminate things that kind of just get in the way and don't add value, let's say. I personally have a hard time understanding why some institutions will perform almost a full review of the project, even though they've agreed to be the relying institution. It seems counterintuitive. I do understand the approach in having sort of a smaller submission with like a summary. I get that, along with the other required documents, just to have some context and know what you're getting into. But I think we need to be careful not to be so risk averse that we just say, you know what, we'll agree to this, but we still have to review every single thing. And that takes away the best part of the Reliance Agreement, which is to help the investigators get moving. I mean, I've always thought that as human subjects research protections administrators, our goal is to not be a roadblock and to help to kind of grease the skids for the investigators so they can really get moving forward.
Totally. And I think, when a relying institution wants to see the protocol documents, that makes sense to, know what's going on with the research. And you want to see the consent form to make sure it's complying by all of your local regulations and your local and state laws. But when, they have small grammar edits and small edits to the protocol and how it's being conducted, it can be hard. And like you said, a reliance agreement is meant to avoid this duplicative review process. And then that's exactly what ends up happening.
Yeah,
it can be hard working with that.
I completely. I think it follows logically that we jump into how we can continuously improve. How can an IRB office continuously improve on the reliance agreement process? I'm sure there's things that we can do to make it better.
Yeah, when I entered into this role and started working with reliance agreements, I had to first, understand what executing a reliance agreement means, what kind of involvement is required with researchers and IRB offices. So I think if you can look at the process as a whole and find innovative ways to collect the necessary information at the right time points, that can be really helpful. So in my experience, I worked with our administrative reviewers who conduct the review of initial applications to kind of help them identify where there's a multi-site research project. If researchers are working with external investigators, I educated our admin reviewers to educate the researchers on what a reliance agreement is. Hey, you're working on a multi-site research project, you might want to consider a reliance agreement, and then our admin reviewers can kind of push them to work with the reliance agreement team to get this in place. I think finding innovative ways to capture this can be really helpful, more than just, educating your researchers, kind of being that support for the researchers during the IRB review process can be really helpful. And then you can capture, those multi-site studies on the onset rather than maybe missing it during the review process.
Yeah, I mean, the more people that know, the more folks that are cross-trained about the process, the more they can be, see the flags, see the triggers, and reach out to the investigators and say, hey, did you know that you can do this? And it's always nice to hear what the investigators say, because most of them are like, oh, I didn't know about this. This is an excellent tool. I wish I had known, because I would have come to you first. But yeah, I mean, the constant education is really what it's all about. And, I know you've worked with other people in the office to really establish a solid web presence on our office website. And just, we also have an email that people can just go straight to, as opposed to kind of getting lost in the wash of the daily communications. So, keeping things nice and targeted.
Yeah. And we also work with researchers a lot. So I think if you can survey researchers and ask them what we could do better, we were using a Word document to collect roles and responsibilities information, which is basically how I can figure out if we're engaged in human subjects research. Some investigators were just emailing me back the responses. And I know this is a very small change, but going from a Word document to collect your responses via email versus just sending them a list of questions via email really reduces the burden for the researchers, and it helps them feel like it's not that big of a deal to respond to, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So a small change, but definitely makes it easier for the researchers to recognize the questions and respond.
Yeah, any way we can break it down and make it more straightforward for them. I'm sure their
Right.
inboxes are constantly overflowing, so that's a huge help.
Yeah.
So let's we should talk about some of the resources that are out there. Let's say you're basically starting from zero. How can you establish a good reliance agreement process?
Yeah, I very much recommend signing on to Smart IRB. I know we
Yeah.
touched on it a little bit before, but this is a platform created by Harvard researchers to basically streamline the reliance agreement process. It's a great platform for institutions to sign on to. They have so many resources. They have reliance agreement templates that you can use. They have letters of acknowledgement if that's not your speed. But they also have an online platform where you can enter in a multi-site study, and basically assign relying institutions to sign on to this reliance agreement. The Smart IRB SOPs are consistent. So if an institution has signed on to Smart IRB and I am signed on to IRB, I know that they're following the same SOP. So there's no question about what process they're following. So it really makes it a lot easier to work with an institution that is a Smart IRB participant, and they have around like 1,200 participating institutions
That's right.
domestically. So it makes it really easy when you know what SOP the institution is following when you're entering into a reliance agreement.
Yeah, consistency is key.
Yeah. But then also AHRP has really great resources for best practices. The accrediting body for HRPPs, they are a great resource if you're looking to start on. They have websites on how you can create a reliance agreement process, continuing education with researchers, how to, conduct QA efforts for your reliance agreements. It's a good resource also.
Yeah, that's true. And AHRP was, I think, very helpful in kind of pointing us in the right direction during our last site visit. I think it was in 2021, and gave us some very direct pointers on how to improve the process. And I think that since then we have a very robust process that I would consider the gold standard for how to do this, especially at a social behavioral and educational institution. One of the other things, resource-wise, is checking in with peer institutions, right? And that can vary across the country, depending on where you're located. If you're part of the Big Ten, you're part of the SEC. I know that there's a huge California state institution system. They all share resources and do things differently. So that's really a great place to start, because otherwise, you're reinventing the wheel and you have to do all of this by yourself. And somebody's done it before, and you might find something that can make the process even better if you borrow it or they're willing to share.
Totally. I think even just improving our own IRB program, reliance agreement program. I've looked online, just Googling what different IRB offices do, what their web pages look like. I remember, creating a master agreement, and there were several master agreements publicly available for a reliance agreement that I could look at and kind of replicate for our own process. So
I remember that.
very
That's
helpful.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's easy when you can avoid creating legal jargon.
Yeah.
Something like that's already written out.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So since we talked about where to find resources, we got to talk about what you actually do to set this up. So from an organizational perspective, staffing, how to manage this day to day. You've been an integral part of it since we established your position as a reliance agreement specialist. I'm going to turn it right over to you and let you tell us what recommendations you have for HRPOs and HRPPs.
Yeah, a huge part of my role is just staying organized between every collaborative study that I'm working on, every researcher that I'm working with, every IRB office I'm communicating with for a reliance agreement. And so I would definitely recommend that there's a dedicated person working on reliance agreements in each HRPP office if that's something that, your office can do. If you're not organized with all of the different agreements that you're working on and the studies that you're collaborating on, it can be very difficult to keep your head straight. It can be difficult to check in on reliance agreements that might have fallen off another institution's radar, and then the researchers are suffering in the process because it's taken so long to get the reliance agreement in place. So if you don't have this organized system to determine whether your institution can rely and then collect the information that's needed, obtain the necessary signatures, often your institutional officials are pretty busy. And so making sure that that's signed and, following up with them if that's necessary, it's pretty overwhelming. So having one person who can check in on these things on a daily or even weekly basis can be really helpful. I know in my role, not only am I taking in daily requests, but I'm checking in on reliance agreements every 2 weeks. I'm sure institutions are overwhelmed with my emails every 2 weeks, but that's the only way you can keep the ball rolling, and that's the only way we can get the agreement where we need to be. So having someone who's pretty determined is definitely helpful.
Yeah, and I'll say as a supervisor, I mean, it's, we obviously want our people to take vacation and sick time and things like that. So having someone as a backup and cross-trained is imperative as well, even if they're not as up to speed and experienced as you might be. If they're able to follow a list of instructions to keep the process moving along until you're back, that's, it adds a level of comfort. You can enjoy yourself while you're away from the office, so you don't have to worry about coming back to a giant pile of reliance agreement transactions to process. So if anyone is listening who is a supervisor of staff, cross-train in this area in particular.
Definitely. It makes my life a lot easier knowing that I have someone who has my back managing the email address. And like you said, the instructions don't have to be lengthy. They don't have to be very involved. I stress the specialists in our office that you don't need to document everything the way that I would, as long as you can respond to the researchers and get them to the right step. That's all I need. And then the organization stuff I could totally handle.
Right on.
And then another recommendation I have is just documenting everything in a way that works for you. Personally, I have a large Excel tracker sheet with multiple tabs, reliance agreement that's in process, a reliance agreement that's active, and one that's closed. It really helps me stay in touch with what's going on. I mean, at a single time, I could work on maybe 15 reliance agreements. Obviously, 10 of those are kind of pending the other institution's actions. I've been working on it for 6 months or so. But just knowing what is it that I'm working on, what's active and what's closed, it can really help orient you when you're working on so many agreements at once.
Yeah, and I think to sort of wrap it up here on this topic, that's a great way to end it, Vidhi. I mean, there's so many things out there you can pick from, you can choose from, you can mold this to how it works for your institution. And I think that's something that we continue to learn as we work with other institutions, is that there's a reason why they do certain things. And sometimes we might not understand them, and that's okay. But, you don't have to do exactly what another school or organization does. Check out your policies and procedures. Talk to the other members of your human research protection program. Like we mentioned earlier, survey your investigators and see if they've experienced something that really works for them. And don't be afraid to change things, to remove something that doesn't work or to alter something. The goal here is to continuously improve the process. Don't just sit back and let it kind of fly on its own. Sometimes you can do that, but at some point you're going to need to take another look at it and see if there's anything that needs changing.
Some good insights and good advice from the two of you, and I think great reminders for everyone to check in with other people who have similar responsibilities, to benchmark and look for those best practices for your institution. Thank you, Joe and Vidhi, for joining us today. If you have any questions about this topic, please reach out to us at info@phrptraining.com. We hope you subscribe to PHRP Perspectives and join us again next time.